Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the unique show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. As the Syria war continues to rage uncontrollably, a plethora of Islamist groups have attacked Syrian government strongholds in Daraa and Idleb, seeking to break the military deadlock on the ground. Radical Islamists from al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda branch, and an array of more moderate Islamists have recently gained more momentum as the insurgency becomes more dominated by an extremist ideology. Experts have touted some Syrian Islamists as moving to counterbalance al-Qaeda, yet in most parts of Syria, joint military operations by al-Qaeda and the more moderate Islamist groups are currently a norm. This comes as the US has upped its propaganda campaign against the Islamic State after dropping tens of thousands of graphic leaflets southwest of the Syrian city of Raqqa aimed at discouraging Islamic State recruitment, officials said on Thursday. The grisly cartoon-style leaflets show recruits lining up to be shoved into a meat grinder and is part of what the Pentagon formally calls Military Information Support Operations, or MISO, meant to influence thinking on the battlefield. The Pentagon said that US Air Force F-15 planes dropped around 60,000 of the leaflets on March the 16th. But as the dynamics in Syria change yet again, and the Islamist ideology takes more significance, today we discuss how this reflects on the war, on the 4-year-long war in the long term. Joining us from our studio today is Musa Arigani, a political analyst, and from Sydney, Australia, Reem Sakhr also joins the show. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the latest regarding the militant offensive in the north and south of Syria.
Syrian rebels on Wednesday seized an ancient town near the Jordanian border that was a key government stronghold, ousting Syrian soldiers and allied militiamen from the region after 4 days of intense battles, opposition activists and rebels said. There was no immediate comment from the government on the fall of Busra Sham, a town in southern Syria classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its historic citadel, ruins and well-preserved Roman amphitheatre. It was once the capital of the Roman province of Arabia and a stopover on caravan routes to Mecca, according to UNESCO. Busra Sham had been in the hands of President Bashar Assad's troops throughout the 4-year-old conflict and was considered to be a stronghold of pro-government forces in the southern province of Daraa. The town's capture is a strategic gain because of its geographical location as well. Busra Sham is perched on highlands 10 kilometers, or 6.2 miles, from the Jordan border, overlooking the plains that spread out from the southern outskirts of Damascus. This comes as the Islamist brigades in the south begin an offensive to take the pressure of other rebel areas under attack in the south. They included members of al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, the Nusra Front group. No major damage was done to the citadel or amphitheatre, but the Busra al-Sham Hotel, the biggest and best-known hotel in the region, and nearby historic souks were destroyed in the fighting. Other archaeological sites had been looted by various armed groups and criminals over the past 2 years. Busra Sham is a predominantly Sunni town with a population of about 30,000, but also has a sizable Shiite community. The push on Busra Sham coincided with rebel gains in northern Syria on Wednesday near the city of Idlib, where a consortium of rebels launched an offensive a day earlier. The target of the operation is Idlib. Activists said rebel fighters made advances from the city's eastern side, seizing 3 government checkpoints. Idlib has been a hotspot for the uprising and insurgency, with its rugged terrain and its high hills suited to guerrilla warfare. Idlib has been a hotspot for the uprising and insurgency, with its rugged terrain and high hills suited to guerrilla warfare. Insurgents also launched a bold 3-pronged attack on the city of Idlib Tuesday, seizing territory on the outskirts of the government-held, largely isolated city in the northwest. Government media acknowledged that fierce fighting was underway throughout the day and said that regime forces had killed dozens of insurgents east and west of the city. The local coordination committee's network of anti-regime activists said that street fighting was underway in Idlib as the rebels seized a school near the Justice Palace.
Mr. Musa, thanks for joining us today. How has the battlefield dynamics changed in the Syria war throughout the previous years?
Well, Yes, sorry. Have you finished? Well, yes, I think the international communities now, they have realized what the monster that CIA has created in Baghdad or Iraq by the name of Daesh. Now, Daesh is play on the hand of Bashar al-Assad. And now we are seeing that the Americans' forces are fighting alongside the Iraqi and militias who were supported by the Iranians against the Daesh.
But at the beginning of the Syria crisis, we had this whole concept which was advocated that there were moderate rebels in Syria, there were democratic, peaceful groups who shared an ideological consensus with the Western countries. But at this moment, we have ISIS, al-Nusra Front, different extremist groups. How has it changed over the last 4 years?
Well, let's think a bit more deeply. I mean, the Daesh is part of this so-called moderate forces in Syria. It was created after they fight among themselves.
I mean, we could argue now that the jihadist groups in Syria have literally obliterated the moderate opposition. But some in the US still claim that there is a moderate opposition in Syria and that this opposition has to be funded. To what extent would you agree with the US's perspective that there is a moderate opposition in Syria?
Basically, America got his own agenda. I don't believe that the Americans, they really care whether there is any moderate or non-moderate rebels in Syria, as long as they achieve their agenda. And I don't think there is any moderate one. If there was, they would have come to sit around the table with the government, all the parties in Syria, and solve their problems.
Let's get some different perspective. Reem Sakar, thanks for being with us. Why have rebel groups been so potent in Daraa and Idlib?
Well, thanks for having me. I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that Daraa and Idlib border Jordan and Turkey. The fact that Jordan and Turkey exist where they are is probably the single biggest reason why this war has continued for so long, why so many Syrians have died. It is no secret that CIA training camps are in Jordan who are training radicals, radical mercenaries who are then sent into Syria from Daraa. And the same with Turkey. Turkey's open border policies has allowed jihadis from 83 countries around the world, including many from Europe and even Australia, to travel to Syria to fight in a jihad war or a holy war.
But Reem, for 1 second, I mean, Turkey as a state would, according to your perspective, would allow these jihadists to enter its land and go and fight in Syria. I mean, wouldn't these jihadists pose a threat on Turkey?
Well, you'd think that they would, but I mean, Turkey has its own reason for doing this, and that is regime change in Syria. Along with its NATO allies and the US, the whole point of this war was regime change in Syria. And so I think these countries possibly thought that they were immune to this jihadi threat, but we're seeing the effect of that during terrorist attacks or so-called terror threats that are happening in Europe right now. And Turkey allowed that. Turkey did have an open border policy. It was allowing jihadis into Syria. I mean, other than the fighters that are going through all their weapons, their equipment, their money, the drugs, that was all passing from Turkey into Syria, so these groups could fight the Syrian government that would eventually be toppled in their view.
But Turkey would actually argue that They're a state which is part of NATO. They have opened their borders to innocent refugees who have been fleeing a war and different levels of violence and killing. So this open border policy would be justifiable in a humanitarian term. So would you argue that the human rights aspect justifies Turkey's open border policy?
I think, okay, well, regarding the refugees that Turkey took, it's also a known fact that Turkey did set up its refugee camps long before any refugees came out of Syria. And so you need to think about that and think, why would they set up refugee camps before there were any refugees? And of course, the answer to that is because the Syrian war, what's happening in Syria now, was orchestrated and planned. But there is a difference between refugees leaving Syria, crossing the Turkish border through the legitimate border crossings, and then terrorists coming through.
Bear with us for 1 second. Mr. Musa here. The Syrian uprising was manufactured, it was orchestrated. I mean, some would say this is, in essence, a conspiracy theory. Others would say there is an element of truth. But one thing is for certain, what happened in Syria was a popular revolution, a popular uprising, which was against a dictatorship. Would you not agree?
To some circumstances, yes, but let me just go back to Deborah. I completely agree with Deborah that this Daesh was created by CIA, and they started training them in 2011 in Jordanian camps. It's the same mistake, the foreign policy of the US, when they started training Taliban against the Russians. From Taliban we got Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda now we got Daesh. And sooner or later, this Turkey or other coalitions or so-called Arab friends, Daesh will catch up with them, and they will have the same problem as US has now.
But there are not all Daesh. I mean, you discuss ISIS as if they're the group which controls the whole of Syria. There are other groups, moderate groups, different types of moderate Islamist groups. I mean, the whole Syria conflict is not just necessarily ISIS. What would you say to that?
I agree with that to some certain extent. There are some moderate groups in Syria which they are willing to talk to Assad and solve the problem, but there are other groups that they are not happy to talk to Assad or involve Assad in any discussion about the future of the country. So how can you call those one moderate and others non-moderate who are supporting the Syrian government? But
we could argue now that two of the most significant provinces in Syria, both Daraa province and Idlib province, which as our guest from Sydney stated, border areas with other countries which have had anti-Syria policies. So these border areas which we see an influx of fighters and arms from countries like Jordan and Turkey, is this a significant factor as to why the Syria crisis has now entered its 5th year?
Yes, I agree with that. And of course, these are the countries like the Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Jordan. In some circumstances, they are training them, arming them, and also financing them, and sending them to Syria to fight so-called illegitimate government. At the same time, the same countries, they are calling the Houthis government as legitimate.
But Western countries would argue that it is the Iranian presence in Syria and it is the alliance of Hezbollah, which is listed as, its military wing is listed as a terrorist organization within the European Union. It is Iran and Hezbollah which have actually allowed the Syrian government to prolong its existence for the 5th year in a row.
The Iranians always said that we support people's decision. There is no evidence that there is Iranian forces in Syria. Of course, they do help them logistically, and they support the Syrians. but they do not have armed forces there.
Okay, we've gone to an extent off topic, but I'd like to go back to Reem Sakar here. We understand that there are scores of Druze villages under the rule of al-Nusra Front. How have they been able to coexist so easily?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're coexisting so easily. Well, the Druze people are known to develop a strong connection to the land that they live on, and in times of war or troubles, they don't easily abandon their land. That's why you see a lot of Druze communities who live in the occupied Golan Heights. After Israel took control of that area, they didn't up and leave. They remained where they are. Now, the Druze in Idlib are much outnumbered, and they're not as well armed as the Druze that you'd see in Sweden, who had time to prepare and arm themselves in preparation of an attack on the province in the south in Sweden. And so I think what they're doing is just finding a way to not be pushed off their land, and just finding a way to basically stay alive. And so we hear of negotiations that are happening between Jabhat al-Nusra there and the Druze people, and you know, they have a list of demands that are ridiculous, of course, such as converting to their type of Islam and openly practicing their type of Islam.
Has this ideological kind of authority which has been imposed by al-Nusra Front, especially on the Druze population in Idlib, there are approximately between 13 and 26 Druze villages now under the control of al-Nusra Front to certain degrees or extents. I mean, is this ideological factor playing a part in actually threatening the existence of the Druze in Idlib province?
Well, I guess it does. Yes, it does. Because, you know, right now we see that the Druze have probably accepted some of the demands of the Jabhat al-Nusra Islamists, and that is, you know, to convert to their version of Islam, even though the Druze do consider themselves Muslim, by Jabhat al-Nusra, they're considered to be apostates. So, you know, regarding
have there been actual incidents of targeting or assassination or of killings of some sorts?
Well, large-scale killings you know, I don't personally know if any large-scale killings have happened, but I do know that they have imposed on them to destroy their tombs, their graves, to start praying in their mosques, and the Jabhat al-Nusra mosques, and not the places of prayer that the Druze normally go to. And with the Druze, with the community, or with people who were historically persecuted, kind of hiding their religion and adapting to the majority is something that they are able to do, for instance. So the Druze are known not to pray 5 times a day like mainstream Muslims, but they accepted, you know, these kind of demands, and they have no problem with that. But where what's not working now in Idlib is that Jabhat al-Nusra has now demanded to have marriages with, you know, between the Druze communities and the Islamists, and that's where it's not working. So I think what's happening with the Druze, they're just trying to find a way to basically stay alive until something happens.
I mean, considering this influx of highly volatile Islamist groups in the north of Syria, is Al-Qaeda now a part of Syrian society? I mean, the popularity of al-Nusra Front would suggest so, wouldn't it?
No, certainly not. When Jabhat al-Nusra enter an area, they're not invited into that area. They go in with mortars and with suicide car bombs. If you go to Ma'lula, the people of Ma'lula will certainly not tell you that Jabhat al-Nusra was popular there. They still walk around the streets. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra did take over Ma'lula for a period of time, but after they were forced to pull out by the Syrian army, you can still see their graffiti in the streets.
But however, they did treat the nuns of Ma'lula in a very respectable manner, which is something which has raised their international profile and kind of taken away the stigma attached to them that they were just Al-Qaeda killers.
Yeah, just because they weren't beating the nuns and they didn't behead any of them, it doesn't mean that they treated them. I think the nuns attracted a very large-scale media attention, especially in the West. So, Jabhat al-Nusra and Qatar went into damage control, and so when they did release the nuns, they were said to have been treated very fairly and very nicely, but why did they take the nuns in the first place? And people need to know what they did to the monastery where the nuns came from. The Saint Takla monastery was completely burnt to the ground. The grave of Saint Takla was opened up. Her bones were taken and stolen, and all artifacts, anything that was worth anything in that monastery was stolen. Statues of Jesus Christ were beheaded. So if they were really, moderate and not as, not the Al-Qaeda killers that people blame them to be, or people say that they are, why did they go and trash the monasteries? But I just believe there was a lot of pressure on them to return the nuns by the people who are financing them.
Now, ISIS is a group which has a very large amount of foreign fighters, whereas Al-Nusra Front, which is a more Syrian kind of nationalist version of Al-Qaeda, if you'd like, has a majority section of Syrian fighters who are actually from Syria and were born and bred in Syria. Why is that? I mean, why does Al-Qaeda in Syria have a much more Syrian backbone than ISIS?
Well, I think I wouldn't say the majority are Syrian. There really aren't any, I guess, reports or studies that were conducted on the nationality
but the majority
of
Al-Nusra Front fighters, I mean, it has been even stated by themselves in their official recordings that foreign fighters are actually a minority. It was their policy upon coming into Syria to actually have a minimum amount of foreign fighters and to rely on a backbone of hardened Syrian fighters who had been in Iraq. So why is it so popular? I mean, Al-Nusra Front control large sections of Idlib province and other areas. Why is this?
Well, just because Al-Nusra Front is popular amongst radical Islamists, it does not mean that they are a legitimate organization. They should be given legitimacy. A lot of the so-called FSA groups that were fighting the Syrian government, a lot of them have disintegrated now, and they have joined Jabhat al-Nusra. And so maybe that is where Jabhat al-Nusra gets its numbers from. And being popular amongst these Islamist groups could be because maybe they are better armed, they are better funded, their sources of funding are coming from outside, whereas other groups probably didn't have that type of funding. But they certainly do not represent Syrian society. The Syrian people are very much resisting Jabhat al-Nusra and other sectarian murder gangs that are running havoc in the country. And through the Syrian army, they are resisting that. So I wouldn't say that they represent Syrian society, and I wouldn't say that they are popular at all. They're probably popular amongst killers and the Islamists and Al-Qaeda, not Syrian society, no.
Reem, stay with us for now. Musa, yes. Why has Al-Qaeda been so potent in Syria?
I'm sorry. I don't think that Al-Qaeda has been so powerful in Syria. Actually, they are losing the power in there. And they are the one actually brought the sectarianism in Syria. I mean, the Syrian people were living with the Christians, with Jews for hundreds of years with no problem. And you mentioned that they are becoming more powerful and popular in Syrian society. That's a wrong assumption at all. And I don't think the Al-Qaeda is becoming more powerful in Syria. Actually, they are losing the battle among the Syrian people and also international community. As you can see, the Al-Qaeda or Daesh now in Iraq are losing the battle to the Shia and Sunnis with the help of Americans.
Mr. Musa, we would have to argue now that in Syria, what is occurring on the ground is different to what's happening in Iraq. You have an international coalition to fight ISIS in Iraq, whereas in Syria we have an Al-Qaeda group called Al-Nusra Front, which is now gaining more territory and gaining more momentum.
It's not different than in Syria. What happens actually in July 2012, Abu Taha, one of the operative of Al-Qaeda, head of operative of Al-Qaeda, he said, our big hope is, I quote, our big hope is to form a Syria Iraq Islamic State for all the Muslim and a new war against Iran and Israel. And this is a war Sunni versus Shia. They are the one who brought the sectarianism in Iraq and in Syria, and they are losing the war.
Now, Baathism is the ruling ideology in Syria. What does it tell you about this ideology when so many Syrians have joined Islamist groups, rebels, Al-Qaeda? I mean, has Arab nationalism in Syria been a mere excuse for dictatorship?
Well, Arab nationalism, as it says, doesn't exist anymore. Baathism, when it came on power in 1940 by Michel Aflaq, and then formed in 1947, actually, they were talking about one Arab nation. At the moment, doesn't exist. There is no one Arab nation.
But even Michel Aflaq and these individual figures who you are discussing, these you could argue patrons of Arab nationalism, they wouldn't agree with a one-party system, would they? Or a state which has had emergency law for the last 40 years. I mean, is this justified?
Well, they were talking about one Arab nation, or in a way, you say, one way of dictatorship. But that's what the dictatorship exists in Middle East, in most of the Arab countries.
Okay, keep the thought there. Reem, back to you. How do you perceive the situation on the ground today? The rebels are not winning, but they're certainly not losing. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, today, I believe that the Syrian army has made very significant gains on the ground, and people in Damascus are very optimistic about that. An example, I think on all fronts they are making gains, but a big example is Jobar in late last year, which was a big deal. Now, the Syrian army is making gains around, the Damascus area and Damascus countryside. But it's really hard to, judge the success of the Syrian army or of these terrorist groups, because what you find happens a lot is that, the terrorists go into an area, occupy it for a week, and then the army comes and pushes them out. And then it's like a back and forth. So I guess you do get a stalemate in some areas.
Now, the weaponization of the Syria war, I mean, to this tragic degree, has killed all hope for a political settlement. I mean, how do you see events ultimately unfolding now?
Well, I tend to agree with that, with the, probably there being not much hope for a political settlement. But let's not forget that the countries who would be involved in a political solution or a political settlement, if there was to be one, were never really interested in a political solution. An example of is them cutting all ties with the Syrian government and sanctioning it from early on in the conflict. Now, if you were
What
looking
countries
for
are you discussing? Which countries do you mean?
well, okay, specifically the United States and the European Union, Australia as well. I can say that since I'm here. When you cut ties with the Syrian government, it's basically you have excluded the most important political body in that country, not to mention a political body that has an overwhelming majority support of the majority of its people. So the fact
what is the view from Australia, seeing as you're there? I mean, is there this narrative that the Syrian government must be rehabilitated, or is it as illegitimate in terms of Australian eyes as it is now in American eyes or British eyes?
Well, in Australia, unfortunately, we tend to follow our foreign policy is basically copied off American foreign policy. So whatever the Americans do, the Australian government would be doing. Of course, Bashar al-Assad was declared illegitimate a long time ago, and so the Australian government adopted that. Right now, we're not really sure what the Americans are doing. One day they say they want to negotiate with Bashar al-Assad, and then the next day someone else comes out and says, no, we didn't mean Bashar al-Assad, even though they said Bashar al-Assad. So Australia still hasn't commented on that yet, but you can be assured that whatever the Americans do, the Australians will be following.
Okay. Reem Sakar, journalist and political blogger, joined us from Sydney, Australia. Thank you for your participation. Now, minorities in Syria have borne the brunt of the rise of ISIS and other Islamist groups, as their presence in the Middle East as a whole is seemingly under threat. Last month, ISIS kidnapped over 200 Assyrians from the north of Syria, whilst Kurdish and other Christian minorities have been continuously targeted, as attacks, murders, abductions, and the humiliation of ethnic minorities in Syria has now reached frightening levels. This led Pope Francis to denounce the intolerable brutality being inflicted on Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria. Before the brutal war engulfed Syria, the country was testament to the religious and ethnic diversity of the Middle East. Arabs of different faiths, Kurds, Armenians, Assyrian Christians, and others lived side by side, embracing tolerance and coexistence. But the increasingly sectarian character of the Syrian conflict and the rise of the Islamic State has threatened to unravel the rich tapestry of Syrian society. To discuss this further, let me introduce Isa Ali, a journalist joining us from London, and Kevok Hapojan, international lawyer and fellow at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, joining us from Beirut. Kevok, let me start with you. The plight of Syria's Christian minority has been less documented than the fate of other minorities in Iraq, for instance. Why do you think this is?
Good evening, first of all, Danny. Nice to join you this evening. Well, I think there are many reasons for this. First of all, because the Syrian Christians were not prepared or familiar with such conflicts or crises like the Iraqi people who were experiencing conflicts and wars within the past decades. In addition, there are many international organizations or human rights NGOs that exist in Iraq, while there are few of them in Syria who work to document the abuses of human rights and atrocity crimes, etc. But I think the most important reason is regarding with the media, because in the beginning of the Syrian crisis, the Western media adopted a policy of undermining the attacks on the minorities or not covering the attacks the attacks towards minorities, because mainly these attacks were committed by the groups who were backed and funded by the Western countries. On the other hand, the Syrian official states or pro-Syrian channels or media, they tried not to focus on minority issues just to avoid being accused of
But precisely, this leads me on to my next question. The Christians have sided with President Assad and thus are an enemy to the rebels. Is there any truth in this?
Well, I think we should stop representing the Christians as side of this conflict. Christians are not part of this conflict. Christians, they can't be part of this conflict, but they can and must be part of the solution. Christians in Syria, most of the Christians are with the Syrian state, with the Syrian official institutions, the Syrian rule of law, but not uh, with the catastrophe, with the bloodshed, with the absence of rule or rule of the sword. However, if they have to choose between living under the radical Islamic regime, under the regime of radicalism or the regime of uh, discriminatory behavior, like they used to live with during the 17th or 18th centuries by paying jizyas or by treating them as second-class citizens, they definitely will choose to be with the current government.
Let's bring some different perspective into this. Isa, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Isa, Christian groups have set up defence militias and local watches, but is this ample defence against groups such as ISIS or Al-Nusra Front?
Well, I mean, firstly, the first thing to address is just in the last point, you mentioned that, the accusation that the Christians took the side of the Syrian government, therefore the rebels went against them. I think it's the other way around. I think the Christians feared some of the rhetoric coming out from the rebel groups and put their lot in with the government. I don't think they had any other choice. I think when you have rebel groups making the kind of threats that they were making in the early days of the uprising, you kind of find that people see a very bleak future. And so what it's led to now, and to come to your question, is a case where you do have Christians in different parts of, and again, I think we have to link the two countries, because we've seen, ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, declare that Iraq and Syria are one theater of combat, and I think both the governments and the people of those countries have to treat them the same. So when you see Christians in Syria struggling, they have to tie that to the struggle of the people in Iraq and the Christians of Iraq. And we've seen in Iraq and Syria these militias, these self-defense groups pop up. And it isn't enough just to expect these people, because, they don't have huge populations. It's not enough to expect them to do it themselves. And we've seen actually in Iraq, for example, one of the main Shia groups, the Kataib Imam Ali, have raised a joint militia between Christians and Shia militia to fight against the Islamic State.
And we had the same with Assyrian militias as well in other areas.
We had the same with the Syrians, we had the same in Syria as well. Even Lebanon, I mean, this is a problem which is spreading from Libya all the way, to Pakistan. And we're seeing now more coordination, reports of Hezbollah training in Lebanon, not just Christians, but Druzis, Sunnis even, Shias, everybody who has a joint interest and a joint desire to see this.
If we were to pinpoint, why have the Christians been targeted in the first place?
Well, I think we have to look at it and be very frank in this discussion that there's a very intolerant strand or very intolerant reading of the religion of Islam, which is being supported, as we know, financially and morally by Saudi Arabia and to a lesser degree Qatar and other countries, which holds that anyone who doesn't have the same narrow interpretation as them is an infidel who deserves either death or slavery. And this extends to Christians. It extends to, obviously, Shia Muslims and Muslims from other schools of thought who, in their narrow interpretation, aren't the right, religion. And so we've seen Christians who have had thousands of years of presence in the region, all of a sudden having their lives turned upside down by this very narrow interpretation, supported by a country which doesn't allow churches to be built, despite the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. In Arabia, we had Christians living with the Muslims. We've had them in Syria, we've had them in Iraq, and yet this interpretation seeks to, almost bring a new ideology into the region, which is tearing away the fabric of what's been thousands of years of, harmony, for the most part, people living together. And I think, there's a wider game here, which is certain countries in the region Israel, Saudi Arabia, are threatened by a society or societies which have managed to maintain that kind of unity. So the Christians are a target, the Shias are a target, any Sunni Muslim who doesn't strictly follow their ideology is a target. And these people are so intolerant that even, ISIS calls Jabhat al-Nusra Kafir, infidel, and Jabhat al-Nusra calls ISIS Kafir, and they get to a point where they would even kill their own parents because they don't believe that they're real Muslims. So it's a real problem with the ideology which is behind these groups.
If we could take this to Kevork quickly. Kevork, the issue of Saudi Arabia, Israel, all these other different states and actors and groups which have an influence on religion within the region, are they a factor in why the Christians are being pursued now?
Excuse me, could you repeat the question, please?
Is the influence of Saudi Arabia and Israel on a regional level a reason as to why the Christians are being pursued today?
I think we shouldn't blame only Israel and Saudi Arabia for misbehaving.
Who would you blame?
Excuse me?
Who would you blame?
I would blame the intolerance. I would blame the ignorance of some groups. I would blame the extremism ideas. I would blame the ideology of some groups who were trying to implement their one-sided point of view on the people and refusing the other.
If we could take this back to, if we could take this quickly back to Isa, just for a last perspective. Isa, is there a future for Christians in Syria and the Middle East?
Yes, there is a future for Christians and for all ethnic minorities, and there should be. And again, one of the things which has heartened me is to see how in Syria we've seen people from the other sects coming and helping and training and bringing them in, because at the end of the day, from a moral perspective, it's the right thing to do, and from a religious perspective as well. Each Muslim has a responsibility to protect everybody he lives with, every neighbor of his. And, to go back to the other brother mentioned that, he wouldn't strictly name Saudi Arabia. Of course, not just them, but the ideology he mentioned has, we have to be very frank, got its support from the petrodollars coming out of that country.
Would you also say that some Arab governments using the issue of Christians as an international calling card, for example, would that actually help perpetuate the whole crisis and the whole conflict to a further extent?
I mean, not to go too far onto a digression, but we've seen the Arab countries be purely opportunistic in this latest episode in Yemen, for example. And I wouldn't be surprised to see them take over. And, one looks at a country like Jordan and the actions they've taken in the region, and it makes one think these people can't be that, stupid to think that ISIS won't turn around one day and target them. And yet we've seen this double game. On the one hand, they claim to be against ISIS and wanting to help Christians. On the other hand, they look the other way when these things happen, and they've been training these kinds of groups and funding these kind of groups. So, I believe absolutely that some of these governments, not all of them, but some of them have been very opportunistic and very, unfortunately, very cynical in how they've dealt with the issue of the minorities.
Okay, Isa, just bear with us for a short while. Musa, if I could take this to you, the plight of Christians in Syria is similar to the plight of Christians and other ethnic minorities in Iraq. How much of this is down to sectarianism?
Well, as one of our colleagues said, I think Isa Ali said, all the Christians are living in Syria, they are Syrian. They have a right, same as other Syrians. And sectarianism was not existed there, or whether if there was none visible. And this sectarianism was created by Daesh and al-Wahhabi ideology. They even called their Shias as a kafir or infidel. So the sectarianism actually plays a good hand for the Western policy to interfere in the Muslim country. As we mentioned that for hundreds of years, different sects, different religions, they lived in those in the Middle East without any problem. So who created this sectarianism is actually the West itself. Now they're creating same thing between Shia and Sunnis. The difference between them, there is no difference between Shia and Sunni.
If we could take this back to Isa very quickly, I mean, Isa, why has the Western countries lacked urgency in dealing efficiently enough with a way of saving the Christians?
I mean, I really don't want to sound like a broken record, but we have to look at the influence that a country like Saudi Arabia wields. I mean, let's break it down into a small way. We have so-called human rights organizations which are blaming the Syrian government and blaming the Shia volunteers for fighting against ISIS, who have remained silent when Yemen is bombed by these countries. Now, these organizations, many of them receive funding from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia funds the media. And so what we see is when it comes to these issues, the media calls it Islamist violence. And they don't specify which country is funding these people, which country is creating this ideology and supporting this ideology. And so when it suits them, they make everything a sectarian issue. They, for example, this week have been saying the Shia Houthi militants. The Houthis in Yemen have support from the Sunnis, they have support from different groups. It's not strictly Shia. So it's this game which, and as we know, the Saudis are very close with the West. The king comes and has tea with the queen every year and goes to the White House and is a big supplier of oil for the Western market. So we have a situation where, these countries, as the previous commentator mentioned correctly, it helped to divide the Middle East. Previously, they divided the Middle East along, ethnic lines and giving each country, just drawing a piece of line on a map and saying, there's your country. Now they want to divide these countries even further and keep people
Thank you, Isa. Thank you there.
Yeah.
Isa Ali there, journalist, joined us from London. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If we could take this to Kevok. Kevok, what can be done to restore Syria's social fabric? Is it too late?
I don't think it's late. Even it's late, better late than never, However, we should bear in mind that Syria is a multinational, multicultural, multilinguistic, and multi-religious community. So we should focus on the multiplicitness of the Syrian fabric, and we should. I think we should avoid imposing only one kind of identity or one kind of policy to solve or to rebuild the bridges between different segments of the Syrian communities. I believe in the concept of Syrianism. I mean the Syrian identity, to agree on a basic and fundamental issues and avoid the sectarian or the divided concerns that we have.
Kevok, what is the situation with the Armenians in Syria? Are they targeted? Has there been a repeat of the events of Kassab?
Well, few minutes ago we were talking about regional actors. We should mention also the role of Turkey in the Syrian conflict. Turkey has been playing a destructive role in the ongoing conflict in Syria. And with regards to the Armenians, for Turkey, it's very important to eliminate the Armenian existence in Syria, because the Armenian communities in Syria, who exist in Syria for centuries, but after the Armenian genocide of the 1915, most of the displaced Armenians from Anatolia came to Syria and resettled there. They want to get rid of the Armenians from Syria because they are the living evidence of the Armenian genocide. And this is why they are targeting the Armenians by funding and backing and providing logistical and intelligent support.
Is this the reason then why they would arm the militants and allow for logistical support to be sent to them?
One of the reasons, I think so, yes. Yes.
Okay. Kevok, if you just bear with us quickly, I'll get back to you. If we could take this to Musa. Musa, what states have been complicit in the persecution of Christians in Syria and Iraq? If you could name some.
Well, the same states that supporting Daesh, for example, as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Jordan, or even Pakistan, who are the allies of USA.
But the Assad government as well has hidden behind the Christians in a sense and used it on an international media level,
it's
according to Western journalists and Western media personnel. I mean, how would you assess this? Is there an element of truth in this fact?
Well, yes. I think it's a bit unfair to say that. Assad actually is protecting his own people. Christians, Armenians, or Assyrians, they are Syrians. And if Assad is taking action against Daesh or using this card for his benefit, he's protecting his own people. You can't blame him for that.
But some would accuse him of using barrel bombs, of using the most volatile forms of crude weaponry in warfare. I mean, other people wouldn't see it as protecting his own people. Do you see why they would see it in such a different way?
I'm afraid this is what happens sometimes in a war.
Okay, if we take this to Kevok. Kevok, the Assyrians kidnapped by ISIS in Al-Hasakah, what does this actually mean for the Assyrian population?
Well, this act is one of the shameful scenarios that we are witnessing every day in Syria's events. I mean, kidnappings, bombings, attacks, destruction of cultural heritages, buildings, attacking civilian areas. It's acts on a daily basis that we are witnessing in Syria. But Assyrians particularly, they are, besides being one of the Christian minorities, they are also one of the indigenous people of these lands, and they have been living in Syria for 1,000 years. So I think when we try to eliminate this segment of the Syrian fabric, we will lose a lot of in front of the history.
Kevok, last question, Kevok. I would like to ask you as to one very significant issue. There has been growing international criticism of the use of barrel bombs, especially in Aleppo. Is this criticism justified?
Well, I think when it is war, sometimes you have to adopt policies to put an end to the ongoing bloodshed. I don't justify the use of the barrels, and also I don't justify the attacks made by the opposition on the civilians. So we should agree to put an end to the ongoing conflict by different ways, by different solutions. There aren't only one way to put an end. I don't think that the military solution or the we can put an end by only military actions. We should start negotiation. We should start dialogue with each other. We shouldn't expect from the foreigners to bring a solution to us.
Kevok, thank you very much. Kevok Haipajan, international lawyer and fellow at the Office of the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, joined us from Beirut. Thank you very much for being on the show. Musa, last question to you. Deadly attacks by rebel groups in Aleppo, in terms of mortars, have been now seen on a regular basis in pro-government areas of the city. How deadly and crude are mortar attacks?
Well, any weapons that kills the civilians in a mass scale is crude and is condemned, whether it could be by the Syrian government or the rebels. The fact is here, if we want to stop this kind of massacres, we have to go to the root of the problem, which are the countries who are supplying these weapons to these rebels, such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and
Musa,
USA.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. A big thank you to all my guests, and we leave you on a more cheerful note.
Syria is home to some of the world's most historic sites. Its geographic presence allowed for the most archaic and oldest of civilizations to pass through its territory. No location is as important as Palmyra. The ancient city is one of the oldest historical cities in the world. Its ruins are spread over a large area. As a commercial hub, it is of the utmost importance, joining between Asia and Europe, as well as being one of the most rich, great and affluent cities. Its artifacts and monuments are plentiful, being among the most important in all the ancient cities in greatness and luxury. The Bosra Theatre is equally grandesque. It is one of the largest and most beautiful archaeological terraces, which has maintained historic buildings in most of its divisions on the runway. It can accommodate more than 15,000 spectators in the stands and is characterized by many entrances. Most studies suggest that the theatre was built after the year 106 AD. The theatre of Bosra is one of the few Roman theatres that have remained preserved. Tourism in Syria has been devastated by the war. Minister Bashir Yazigi and South African Ambassador Sean Beneveld discussed the issue at length recently in accordance with a memo of understanding signed by the two sides in 2006. Syria was said to be benefiting from expertise in tourism planning, training and media with South Africa. Minister Yazigi briefed the ambassador on the state of the tourism sector in Syria and the damage caused to it by what he described as terrorism, lauding the South African government's position regarding the crisis in Syria and its support for the Syrian people. He also said that South African companies will be given priority in participating in the reconstruction process and tourism and economic projects. In turn, Beneveld said that South Africa wants to develop economic relations and strengthen the friendship between the two countries, noting that Syria has significant tourism potential due to its rich history and cultural heritage. Life in Syria continues, however, despite the war. An exhibition for traditional Oriental handicrafts and products opened on last Tuesday in the historical Khan Assad Bashar in the Old City in Damascus, organized by the Artisan Association for Oriental Handicrafts, with the participation of 25 craftsmen and artisans. The two-day exhibitions features woodwork, copperwork, pottery, mosaics, textiles, marble works, Oriental musical instruments like the oud and the qanun, and the traditional Arab calligraphy, among other crafts. Head of the Artisan Association, Faoud Arbash, said that this exhibition seeks to showcase the deep-rooted crafts of Damascus and the creativity of its craftsmen and artisans. The Artisan Association for Oriental Handicrafts specializes in traditional Oriental handicrafts, covering 35 crafts and including around 120 members. It also helps export traditional handicrafts to many countries.
For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Till next time.